oranges and grapes are grapes are relatively low. Um, Pears and raspberries, again, are pretty high. When you look at breads, again, white bread versus wheat bread, there's a modest difference. If you add, though, if you buy a product where a brand has or fiber has been specifically added, then you can get up to some relatively high numbers shown here for the wheat brand cereals, and the same is true for some of the breads that have supplemented fiber. As you can see from breakfast cereals, there's a difference between cornflakes and oatmeal.
That's why I said I'd be eating
But sugar
peanuts.
wheat has more. The difference between brown rice and white rice is five-fold. That doesn't look like that much, but remember,
Peanuts is the
serving
highest
is relatively
fucking
small,
fiber
and
right there,
we'll talk about that in a
9.1.
moment. So if you're eating a fair amount of whole grains, it contributes. Tree nuts are relatively high, and peanuts are quite high in fiber.
Raspberries, same shit I be eating. Raspberries, blueberries,
and
blackberries,
some of the green leafy vegetables as well. Powdered
oatmeal,
psyllium is
oranges,
a product
blueberries, high in
one of the
fiber,
brand
apples,
names is
high in fiber,
Metamucil, and there are a
pears,
variety of
high in
others on the
fiber.
market. It's a soluble fiber that you can take mixed in juice or water or tea or whatever to increase your dietary fiber. And we recommend this medically at times for patients as a, quote, medicalized way. This a product, one of the brand names is Metamucil, and there are a variety of others on the market. It's a soluble fiber that you can take mixed in juice or water.
Yeah, I was taking that at one time. I need to take it
Amount
again. My stomach
of whole
be acting
grains,
up.
it contributes. Tree nuts are relatively high, and peanuts are
Raspberries
high in
are
fiber.
really high,
Legumes are
8.0.
almost universally high in
Get some
fiber,
raspberries, wheat
and some
bran
of the green leafy
cereal,
vegetables as well.
oatmeal,
Powdered psyllium
apples,
is
pears,
a product,
peanuts,
one of the
shredded
brand names
wheat,
is Metamucil,
all
and there
the
are a variety of
highest
others on
ones
the
of
market. It's
fiber
a
right
soluble
there.
fiber that you can take mixed in juice or water or tea or
Get some
whatever.
Metamucil fiber
Between brown
supplement.
rice and white rice is five-fold.
I used
That
to
doesn't
drink
look
that,
like
put it
that
in my
much, but
drink.
remember, a serving is relatively
Keep it
small.
moving,
We'll talk
help
about
my
that in a
stomach
moment. So if you're
digestion.
eating a fair amount of whole grains, it contributes. Tree nuts are relatively high, and peanuts are quite high in fiber. Legumes are almost universally high in fiber, and some of the green leafy
Beans,
vegetables as well. Powdered psyllium is
spinach,
a product,
powdered psyllium.
one of the brand names is Metamucil, and there are a variety of others on the market. It's a soluble fiber that you can take mixed in juice or water or tea or whatever to increase your dietary fiber. We recommend this medically at times for patients as a, quote, medicalized way to increase your dietary fiber. But you can see the dose again. It takes you gotta work on this a little bit. That a teaspoon of powdered psyllium is only 3 or 4 grams of fiber, and if you want to get up by 10 or 15, you need to slowly, progressively build that dose up. So you can think about this a little bit more, but you can begin to see the kind of choices you might make as to which breakfast cereal you might select, what fruit you might put in your breakfast cereal, and so forth, and what kind of the use of beans, green leafy vegetables, and nuts are all things you'll hear recur throughout the lecture. All right, let me switch now to dietary guidelines. If you look around the planet, to both in developing cultures and the developed world, but particularly in even some of the most isolated cultures in parts of Brazil or Indonesia or other locales such
fruits
as
and vegetables
that,
and fish.
the people who uniformly have a healthy diet compared to those who do not, the healthy diets have these features. People eat a wide variety of foods. They just don't eat that local root or white rice as their only calorie source. The food itself they eat is high in quality, and they eat the right quantity. And so those are 3 principles that make sense or that are observed from an anthropologic point of view, if you will, but also make sense in terms of thinking about one's own food choices. So, for example, when the four food groups were invented, and this was published after the war, after World War II in the 50s, was sponsored by and supported in large part by the dairy and beef industries, particularly the dairy industry, as a way to work with the government, the Department of Agriculture, to create a variety, greater variety in the American diet. So the problem with the four food groups, or the strength of the four
That
food
bread
groups, is
is
that it
no
focused on
go.
variety. It said don't eat one food group or two food groups, eat four food groups. And so that was what many of us learned in school. Dairy was often, always in the upper left-hand corner where the marketers thought there was the greatest visual appeal. And then the other three food groups were shown grains, meat, fish, and fowl, and fruits and vegetables. And again, the problem there is that there was a focus on, if we go back to our three principles, the four food groups speaks to variety, but it doesn't really say much about food quality or quantity. So there were a couple of others in between the four food groups and the pyramid, but the main intervention was the food pyramid, which came out in the 90s. And this was an attempt to get try a different visual image to make the same point, but now with a little bit more opinion about quality, or relative amount and relative quantities. That is to say, that the idea here was that one would eat low on the pyramid. So the foodstuffs at the bottom of the pyramid, which is where the grains and cereals were, should be the bulk of your intake.
No,
Then the fruits and vegetables.
Fruits and vegetables at the bottom.
Moderate amounts of dairy and meat, fish, and fowl. And at the top of the pyramid is sugars and
bread should be at the top with the sugars.
Sparingly.
The fruits and vegetables should be at the bottom, and the milk and the cheese and all that.
There was a lot of
Meat should be in
value
the middle.
here, but it didn't answer all the questions. For example, if you can see at the bottom under grains and cereals, it says 6 to 11 servings. So it didn't do a really good job of saying, well, is it 6 or is it 11? And so it was that kind of issues, and after about a decade and a half of using the pyramid, the American diet did not really change very much, except in the wrong direction. I took out the slide which shows what we were actually eating, which was an upside down pyramid with tons of fats, oils, and sweets, and most of the grains and cereals were refined carbohydrates. So just the things that we now are pretty clear about wanting to avoid. So in 2010, My Plate came out, and this is the next step by the Center for Nutrition Programs to
some fruits.
Teach the public about dietary guidelines. And My Plate is pretty good. And if you go to myplate.gov,
vegetables should be
a lot of very interesting nutrition information there, and I recommend the site.
Grains should be smaller.
The idea here is that at least half your intake should be fruits and vegetables, that there should be grains and protein, and some dairy. Again, it's not quite as specific in this particular simple graphic as to what goes into each of those categories. But if you drill down a little bit, and this doesn't project well, but it is on the website, or if you print it out on larger font, there's good advice here that's consistent with the dietary guidelines that I'll review in a moment. That at least half your grains should be whole grains, that the vegetables should be a wide variety of vegetables, lots of different colors, similarly with a variety of fruits, dairy, predominantly lower fat dairy or non-fat dairy, and lean meat, fish, and fowl, and protein alternatives such as tofu and legumes and so forth. So there's a lot of detail there, and you can punch in your height and weight and some dietary preferences and come up with some free nutrition advice as to how to achieve these guidelines. So the main points of the guidelines in 2010, and this is still
Yep,
active,
same thing I
and the
told you. Eat half a plate
2015
fruits and
guidelines, which I'll
veggies. You're
show
gonna be
in
eating
just a
whole
moment,
grains, nuts, and
reinforce
seeds.
most of these principles.
Like you
So this
say,
is
take
not
of
out of date,
seafood and fat-free
only
and
one or two
low-fat
changes.
milk. I told
So
you.
the guidelines focus
See, I
on
know what
enjoy
I'm
food
talking
but
about.
eat less,
Seafood.
make half your
Yep.
plate fruits and
Drink water,
vegetables,
more water
consume
instead of
beans, whole
sugar.
grains,
Drink
nuts, and
prepare
seeds,
sodium and foods
increase the
until it's
intake of
lower.
seafood and fat-free and
Consume
low-fat
only
milk and milk
moderate amounts
products.
of lean meats
Drink
and poultry
water
and
instead of
eggs.
sugary drinks. One of Barron's rules is never drink any calories except alcohol. Uh, Compare sodium in foods and choose the lower. We'll talk more about that. And consume only moderate amounts of lean meat, poultry, and eggs. Now, in that latter category is where one of the changes are in the new guidelines
You
because
should eat
eggs
more
have made
lean
it
meat.
back finally onto
Yep.
the okay list.
You should be eating lean meats
So the
too.
new guidelines were just published about a month or so ago, and they've gotten some nice press. They're in draft form. The federal government now tends to put out recommendations in draft form and then lets the public review, comment, and then we'll send out a final version. And then presumably the support on the website
Rich in
behind the
fruits and
recommendations.
vegetables, whole
So
grains,
again, these are
low-fat dairy,
recommendations
seafood,
by
legumes,
a
and nuts.
committee. They meet about every 5 years. And just to highlight the differences, so the main principles are the same. And again, the main principles being these. So these key principles are still the same, with a little bit of difference towards the bottom. So one of the differences that has gotten the most press has been that limitations on dietary cholesterol have been removed. Now, we've known for some time, there are only a few foods that have dietary cholesterol in them, or a few foods that people eat a lot of. Organ meats have a lot of dietary cholesterol, but people don't eat large quantities of them. And shellfish
Like liver.
has a lot of dietary cholesterol, but they're very, very low in saturated fat. So the main issue for dietary cholesterol all these years has really been eggs. And I think part of it is that in some feeding studies, if you put people on different doses of eggs, the blood cholesterol, or the bad part of the blood cholesterol, the LDL cholesterol, will increase. However, it's been known for decades that if you do that experiment while people are on a lower fat diet, especially a low saturated fat diet, that effect is muted. That is to say, if you're on a low saturated fat diet and eat dietary cholesterol, it has very little impact on your LDL cholesterol. So that's been known for some time, but it's finally made it into the guidelines. Clinically, we've been recommending people eat eggs for many, many years. But now it's an official part of the recommendation. So you no longer have to restrict eggs on a low cholesterol or heart healthy diet. They continue to reiterate consuming a diet rich in fruits and vegetables, whole grains, low-fat dairy, seafood, legumes, and nuts. No change there. Probably the thing to focus on, though, if you haven't been already, is the seafood, legumes, and nuts. So those are, we'll talk about some of the advantages of some of those foods in a few moments.
And nuts.
But those
So
are
you're
things
grabbing nuts and eating nuts.
Particular
Trail
attention
mix.
to and may provide.
Telling you, I know what I'm doing. Listen to me.
And consume a diet low in red or processed meats. That's an old recommendation. We'll comment on that in just a moment. Sugar sweetened foods and beverages. No surprise there. And refined grains. So again, if you focus on sugar-sweetened foods and beverages and refined grains, you're going to accomplish a lot of the good here because you typically replace that with the things above it. Now, to get a little bit more quantitative, the recommendations are more specific in this version than they were 5 years ago in the amount of added sugars. The recommendation is less than 10% of calories. To me, that's still way too much. Again, as I mentioned, if you think of desserts as celebratory, you can get down to substantially less than that. And certainly no reason to drink sugary sweetened beverages. Saturated fat has been a little controversial, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But we still recommend, in some, a reduction of saturated fat. So the comment towards lean meat, fish, or fowl and low-fat or non-fat dairy is
Limit
mostly
your
an
coffee
attempt
intake
to
because that shit kills
limit
your
saturated
brain
fat in the diet,
cells.
and limit dietary sodium to a moderate amount of 2,300 milligrams per day, and I'll come back to that as well. As before, half of all grains should come from whole grains. You can make that number substantially higher. Again, there's very little reason to eat refined grains unless you're in an eating environment where that's your only choice. So, that's definitely happens, and that's fine. But when you have choices, there's little reason to eat refined grain. Moderate alcohol is a little bit controversial. Some recent observational
I said
evidence
don't drink
suggesting
no
that maybe
alcohol.
it's not as protective as we thought. Most of the literature for the last at least 20 years has suggested that people who drink moderately live longer and have less heart disease and stroke than people who don't drink, than teetotalers. And that's still the current thinking, but there's been some news or some question about maybe it's not as strong a benefit as we had thought. But the bulk of the evidence is still that moderate alcohol is both safe and may be beneficial.
Don't fuck with the alcohol.
The
No
competing issue
alcohol.
with alcohol is that it does
There's a
increase
lot
the
of
risk of
sugars
breast
in it.
cancer in women. And so for people who are particularly high risk of breast cancer, that's could be an important factor. Remember, the principles of the first lecture are still true here. Remember when I went like this and I said, if someone says your risk has changed by a certain percent, you should immediately say percent of what? And so if your risk of breast cancer is really, really low, increasing it by 20% may not matter very much because 20% bigger of a small number is still a small number. On the other hand, if your risk is high and you increase that by 20%, then that may be more important to you. And so this is all a matter of balancing risks and benefits. And very interesting, the recommendations are very explicit in a statement that's a little bit stronger than I would say in the office. I've been saying for years, and we've been known for years, that coffee is the Teflon nutrient. No matter what disease we try to pin on coffee, no one has been able to pin one. There are some though, but the recommendation actually goes out of its way to say up to 5 cups of coffee per day is not associated with adverse effects in most adults. And again, there's some observational studies that actually go even further and say that coffee is associated with a reduction of cardiovascular disease and stroke. Of course, that's not true if you happen to be the one who gets atrial fibrillation from eating too much coffee, or is very irritable all the day and commits domestic violence, or can't sleep because remember, caffeine has a half-life of in your energy requirement. So 2,000 is sort of a cap, especially as you get older, unless you're really, really exercising extensively. So that means that most people should be eating no more than 6 1-ounce servings a day of grains, and half of those should be whole grains. The problem is that people don't know what a serving is. And so a serving of most grains is about what you can hold in your hand. Now, it doesn't matter if your hand is small or big, just cup your hand, and that's about the amount that a serving is. And you'll be off by a little bit, but it doesn't matter. Because when you go to a Chinese or a Thai restaurant and they serve you some white rice, that's about 6 servings. Or if you go to a moderately priced pasta place and they give you a serving of spaghetti, that's 4 servings.
Yeah.
So you're way, way out of whack, whether it's your hand or my hand. So it's a half a cup of cooked pasta, a half a cup of hot cereal, such as oatmeal, 1 tortilla, not 3 or 6 if you got 3 little tacos, 1 slice of bread, not you're already in 2 if you have a sandwich, a half a bun, a small muffin, about that size. So the kind of muffins you get these days that are about that size are again about 5 servings of carbohydrate, not to mention all the sugar and fat. And then a cup of ready cereal. So one way to remember that is those little tiny single-serve boxes of Special K and cornflakes you get. I don't know if people still eat those very often, but that's a serving. right? So that tiny little bit you get that barely fills the bottom of your bowl, that's a serving of breakfast cereal. So it's a half a cup or half a baseball. So not much. Now the second problem is people don't know how to select whole grains. Well, and the safest, and mostly here we're talking about wheat, because again, the basic science here is that a kernel of wheat has an outer covering, which is the bran or the dietary fiber. It has an inner core, which is the endosperm, which is where most of the healthy oils and vitamins and minerals.
Endosperm.
Boxes of Special K and cornflakes. You get it. I don't know if people still eat those very often, but that's a serving, right? So that 5 servings of carbohydrate, not to mention all the sugar and fat, and then a cup of ready cereal. So one way to remember that is those little tiny single-serve boxes of Special K and cornflakes. You get it. I don't know if people still eat those very often, but that's a serving. Right, so that tiny little bit you get that barely fills the bottom of your bowl, that's which is the bran or the dietary fiber. It has an inner core, which is the endosperm, which is where most of the healthy oils and vitamins and minerals are, and the rest of it is the starchy part of the wheat kernel, which is where all the bread, especially if it's a store-made bread, or to really try to figure out whether it's whole grain or not, it can be a challenge when you're shopping, even in this city. And certainly one of the ways to deal with that is eat less bread. And that way you won't have to deal with the issue quite as much. So I don't think of it quite as celebratory as desserts, but it certainly shouldn't be the mainstay of most diets unless you're quite confident that you're eating whole grain bread and bread product and other carbohydrate products. I'm not going to say much about sugar. Others have spoken on this in this course and elsewhere, and of course with the proposition in the city last fall and all the attention that investigators here at UCSF and elsewhere have gotten for their outstanding work demonstrating the relationship of sugar to both obesity and diabetes. I think this is pretty well appreciated. But the average person in the United States consumes 30 teaspoons of sugar and sweeteners per day, and it's over 15% of calories. As I mentioned, the new guidelines say less than 10%, but I would make that number substantially lower. And as I mentioned, it includes all of the types of sweeteners, including cane and beet sugar, high fructose corn syrup, which I didn't mention last time, dextrose, honey, and so forth. And you can see there's some recommendations for really limiting the amount of sugar per day, and it should be quite low. Again, I think the way to think of this is a product, this being sucrose and high fructose corn syrup, are products that don't really need to be on the planet. And sweetened beverages are really a mistake. Now, I'm not going to say too much about artificial sweeteners, but I'm going to predict that someone will ask a question. So let me just say that the current thinking is that they're not much better. Now, the evidence supporting that statement is not as strong as for